All right, buckle up, everybody, because today we are diving into some uh, fascinating, well, let's just say it, political maneuvering.
Maneuvering.
And, we've got this Fox News segment. Let me tell you, it's a doozy.
Oh, yeah.
So we're talking spending cuts, government shakeups, and, oh, yeah, did I mention Stacey Abrams is in the mix?
Oh, this is going to be good.
And the visual aids, you got to see these visual aids.
Really?
They have this thing, they're calling it a spaghetti map. And it's supposed to show all these federal agencies involved in disaster relief.
I think I've seen that one, yeah.
It's a mess, just a tangled mess. Honestly, I've seen neater bowls of pasta.
It's a pretty effective visual, though. It really plays into Senator Langford's argument about streamlining the government and, giving more power to the states.
It's all about that image of a bloated federal bureaucracy, right?
Exactly.
And Langford really goes in on Biden, contrasting all those campaign promises about fiscal responsibility with what the administration has actually done.
Yeah.
It's like he's saying, remember all that talk? Well, look what they're actually doing. And, of course, he has to throw in the Green New Deal and DEI program.
Right.
Just for good measure.
It's a very clear us versus them narrative.
Yeah, it is.
And it really speaks to a segment of the population that, might be skeptical of those initiatives.
Oh, for sure.
And it could even motivate them to support these spending cuts.
Okay, but here's where things get a little wild. So apparently there was this nonprofit connected to Stacey Abrams, and they received a $2 billion grant.
$2 billion.
You guessed it, for green energy.
Wow.
And the EPA is now basically trying to figure out where all that money went.
Well, that's interesting because the EPA actually pointed out that this nonprofit is pretty new and has never really handled that kind of money before.
$2 billion. That's not exactly pocket change. You'd think there would be, I don't know, a little more scrutiny involved.
Yeah, it raises some questions about oversight, for sure.
So, hypothetically speaking, let's just say some of this money wasn't spent by the book.
Okay.
What happens then? Can the government just, get it back?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's not as simple as sending an email and demanding a refund, unfortunately.
Right.
Langford mentions a few avenues that could be pursued, though. You've got congressional oversight committees.
Yeah.
They could launch investigations, or the president could try to intervene. And then, if there's any sign of actual criminal activity, the Department of Justice might get involved.
Oh, wow.
Like getting back misspent government funds, it's like untangling a giant knot.
Yeah.
It can be messy, it takes forever, and it often depends on a whole lot of political willpower.
And then, just when you thought it couldn't get any more interesting, Elon Musk pops up on Fox News.
No way.
You guessed it. He's sounding the alarm about the national debt.
Makes sense.
Saying, hey, America, if we don't get our financial act together, we're going to be in trouble. No more Medicare, no more Social Security, just a whole lot of debt and regret.
It's strategic, appearing on Fox News. It really aligns with what Langford's saying about those potential consequences of all this unaddressed debt. They're both playing on this fear. And if we keep spending like this, we're going to bankrupt the country and lose essential programs.
Yeah, it's a pretty dire warning. But then, they start throwing around all these numbers about potential savings.
Oh.
And taxpayer rebates, trillions here, billions there. It's almost like an auction for imaginary money at that point.
Well, it can be overwhelming trying to keep track of it all. $2 trillion in potential savings, $1 trillion in cuts, $400 billion back to taxpayers.
I know, it makes my head spin.
It's a lot.
One minute they're talking about $5,000 rebates for every household. The next minute it's $1 trillion in savings. It's like they're playing financial Mad Libs.
And this is where it gets a little tricky. These numbers get thrown around so casually, but you have to remember that there are specific methodologies and assumptions behind those figures. And if we want to make informed decisions, we need to understand those calculations.
So basically, don't believe everything you hear on TV. Shocking, I know. But seriously, it's a good reminder to be a little skeptical when it comes to these big financial claims.
Always a good idea.
Especially government finances.
Exactly. Don't just take those numbers at face value. You have to look into how they were calculated, consider the biases of the sources.
Right.
And always remember, there's usually a lot more to the story than what makes it into a soundbite.
Okay, speaking of history repeating itself. Langford brought up Bill Clinton's efforts to reduce the federal workforce back in the 90s.
Oh, yeah.
He's basically saying it's the same thing Biden is trying to do now. Is that a legitimate comparison?
Well, it's definitely a clever way to frame Biden's action and, presenting them as part of this long tradition of presidents from both parties, all trying to make government more efficient.
Yeah.
But while there are some similarities, the context is very different. Clinton's efforts were part of a larger strategy to address budget deficits and streamline government operations. But what Biden's doing is happening in very different economic and political circumstances.
So not exactly apples to apples then.
Exactly.
Okay, before we go any further, I have to ask about this executive order that Biden just signed. restricting illegal immigrants from accessing federal dollars.
I was wondering when we'd get to that.
Langford seemed to think it's a big win,
Yeah.
comparing it to Bill Clinton's welfare reforms back in the 90s.
Interesting.
Is that a fair comparison?
Well, it's a very complex issue. On the surface, it might seem similar.
Right.
Both involve restricting benefits for certain groups, but the context is pretty different.
Okay.
Clinton's welfare reforms were part of a larger effort to reduce government spending and encourage self-sufficiency. Biden's executive order seems more focused on immigration enforcement and border control.
It's a tough issue, and there are a lot of strong opinions on both sides.
Oh, for sure.
And it brings up a whole bunch of questions. Will it actually save money? Will it deter illegal immigration? Or will it just treat more problems?
All valid questions.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that these types of policies can often have unintended consequences.
Like a ripple effect.
Exactly.
One policy change leading to a whole cascade of impact.
Which are difficult to predict
Yeah.
and control.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground here today.
We have.
But this is really just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
There's so much more to unpack, and we'll be diving deeper into all of it after a quick message from our sponsors.
Can't wait. It's worth noting that this executive order could face some legal challenges.
Oh, yeah.
Opponents are saying it violates the rights of undocumented immigrants and goes beyond the president's authority.
So basically, another round of court battles.
Probably.
Sounds about right. But okay, before we get too deep into immigration policy,
Sure.
let's go back to Langford's top 5 federal fumbles.
Oh, yeah, those are good.
I have to say, I kind of love the sports analogies.
Yeah.
It's like he's turning government inefficiency into a losing football game.
It's a smart way to simplify things and make them relatable to a wider audience.
Exactly. It's like he's saying, hey, you know how much it sucks when your favorite team loses? Well, that's what's happening to America right now.
Because of all this government waste.
Exactly. And who doesn't want to be on the winning team, right? But let's talk about that blown coverage fumble.
Okay.
He's saying that the U.S. is letting China get ahead because we're too busy tripping over our own debt.
It's a pretty common argument, among those who want a smaller government.
Yeah.
They say that all this government spending and regulation is weakening the U.S. economy.
Makes it harder to compete.
Exactly. And they point to China's economic growth and their military expansion as proof that the U.S. needs to get its act together.
It's a sobering thought, for sure. But how much of this is really about fiscal policy and how much is just political posturing? I mean, let's be real.
Right.
Both sides have a history of playing games with the numbers.
That's true. It's easy to get caught up in the rhetoric, but we need to step back, look at the data, and ask some tough questions.
Easier said than done, right? But it's good advice.
Absolutely.
Don't just take things at face value.
Right.
Do your research, think critically.
And form your own conclusions.
Either way, it reminds us to be aware of how information is presented to us.
And the potential biases behind it.
Good point. Always be on the lookout for sneaky Doge propaganda. But speaking of comparisons that make you scratch your head, let's talk about Langford comparing Biden's immigration executive order to Bill Clinton's welfare reforms.
Yeah, that one.
Is that really a valid comparison?
Well, it's oversimplifying things to say they're the same. I mean, both policies aim to restrict access to benefits, but the context and motivations are different.
Okay.
Clinton's welfare reforms were part of this bigger push to reduce government dependency and encourage people to work.
Right.
Biden's executive order is more about border security and immigration enforcement.
And then there's the question of whether these types of policies actually work.
Yeah, that's the big question.
I mean, do they actually save money and achieve their goals, or do they just cause more problems down the line?
It's crucial to look beyond the rhetoric and think about the unintended consequences.
Right, because restricting access to benefits could actually lead to more poverty.
Exactly.
And less access to health care.
And put more strain on social services.
It's like a ripple effect. One change can have a whole bunch of impacts.
That are hard to predict.
And even harder to control.
Exactly.
We've talked about a lot, but I keep thinking about that spaghetti map.
Yeah.
It really shows what a lot of people think about government.
That's a mess.
Yeah, all bureaucracy and inefficiency. And it really makes you wonder how you can even try to change something so complicated.
Well, it shows that classic tension, between wanting smaller government and less regulation, but then also needing the government to do things.
To provide services and fix problems.
Right. It's like this constant balancing act.
Trying to find that middle ground.
Exactly. Where government works, but it doesn't get too big and powerful.
Yeah, it's like walking a tightrope. One wrong step and the whole thing falls apart. And that brings us back to the big question. Will these spending cuts really make government better? Will they reduce the national debt? Or will they just create a whole bunch of new problems?
I wish I had a crystal ball.
Right.
There's no easy answer. There are just so many factors to consider.
Yeah.
How they actually make the cuts, what programs get affected, how people react, and then you have to think about all the things that could happen.
Things we can't even predict.
Exactly, like trying to predict the weather, too many variables.
So, are we just along for the ride then?
In a way, I guess so.
Hoping for the best, but expecting the worst.
Well, the story's not over yet, right? And there will definitely be some surprises along the way.
Oh, yeah.
But one thing is for sure, the decisions they're making now will affect the country for years to come.
Well, that's it for our deep dive into politics and government spending. We've covered a lot, but like always, there's even more to explore.
Right. This is just a starting point.
Exactly. We want everyone to stay informed.
Keep learning.
Have those important conversations.
And keep asking those tough questions.
Because in the end, it's up to all of us to make sure our government works.
It's our democracy, after all.
And on that note, we'll leave you with one final thought.
Okay, shoot.
What role do you want the government to play in your life? And what are you willing to do to make sure our government is effective and accountable to the people? Think about it, talk about it, and most importantly, make your voice heard.
Your voice matters.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time for another one.
Looking forward to it.